This is a story that's lived in the shadow of Australian history for 90 years. Yet it's 5 times greater than the story of Gallipoli because 5 times more Australians served here on the Western Front and 5 times more were killed. The Australians were the only all-volunteer army in World War I, yet they won 53 Victoria Crosses. They taught the Americans how to fight at the Battle of Hamel, and under their own commander, General John Monash from Melbourne, they actually won victory after victory. And this is the story of their greatest battles and how the Australians helped win World War I. That's Anzac Cove. It's strip of beach, 600 metres max, and that is where they landed.
Australian historian and author Dr. Jonathan King commemorated the 90th anniversary of Gallipoli by taking a tour group to Anzac Cove, where he was struck by their enthusiasm and passion. Since 1915, Gallipoli has developed a mythological status, inspiring thousands to make this trip at least once in a lifetime.
It's just something I've always wanted to do. It's just tremendous. I just wish my family was with me.
But if they could be that emotional about a defeat where over 8,000 men and boys lost their lives, why was it, he wondered, that Australians did not seem to care as much about the war in Europe, where they lost 5 times as many and were largely responsible for winning World War I? The Western Front was a series of trenches that stretched 700 kilometres from the Belgian coast to the Swiss Alps. By the time the Aussies arrived, 2 years into the war, the Germans and the Allies were locked in a stalemate. Neither was going anywhere. Thousands were dying over a few metres of land. Jonathan set out on a quest to find out why his countrymen today did not seem nearly as interested, let alone passionate, about the battles Australians fought after they left Gallipoli.
Western Front, yeah.
The Western Front died.
Yeah.
Because all veterans had now died, Jonathan put out a public appeal through newspapers and radio to contact any families and descendants who might have letters, diaries, or photographs to help him tell their story.
Jonathan, good to see you.
Thanks for having us. The descendants were so enthusiastic about this project that they sent me letters, diaries, postcards, photographs. I was inundated. Among the things that descendants sent was a shoebox full of one soldier's letters. These are the original letters from the Western Front. I was also sent magazines, series of magazines written during World War I, photographs from the Western Front. But perhaps the most exciting thing of all that was sent to me, which I didn't even know it existed, I've worked in the field for years, is called From the Australian Front, Christmas 1917. Now that is full of beautiful illustrations and photographs sent from the Western Front in 1917, the first ever book on the Western Front.
Although the fighting started in Europe in 1914, the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, were not sent there until April 1916.
The dear old land is the motherland when she sounds the call.
They had enlisted in the thousands and were keen as mustard, which was good for Britain, as they desperately needed troops to do their bit for king and country. These well-meaning Australians might have been inspired by the heroic tales of Gallipoli.
Gallipoli was the kindergarten, the Western Front was university of warfare. The Australians, when they went ashore at Gallipoli, knew basic small order tactics. They could do infantry attacks at maybe up to the company or battalion level. They go to the Western Front, they graduate to the School of Attacks at Corps and Army level. So they learn an entirely new war on the Western Front.
By the time the Australians arrived in France, the British were heavily involved in the Battle of the Somme, where they had already lost 20,000 men and boys on the very first day of battle. Still Britain's worst one-day killing field. The fighting would go on for months, and the statistics would be horrifying. Britain, 425,000 casualties. Their allies, France, 195,000, and the German enemy, 650,000 casualties. In just this one campaign. It was a miracle anybody survived. One of those survivors was a Scottish soldier, William Chambers, who later migrated to Australia, where Jonathan located his granddaughter, who still treasures his diary and photos.
Well, we have a couple of photos here. One of them is of him in his kilt, because all the Scottish regiments went to war in their kilts.
I know that the Germans said they only frightened of two soldiers.
Yes.
The Australians with their slouch hats.
Yes.
Or the Scottish with their kilts, and they called them the wild women of hell.
And this is the account of his wounding in the Battle of the Somme. The machine gun in front of us is firing. I can plainly see the German gunner in his coal scuttle helmet. I fire off my rifle at him and think of the 2 Mills bombs I have in my pocket, when suddenly, crash! And I'm knocked over like a rabbit. I roll over and try to get up, but I find I cannot stand, so I crawl on till I come to a shell hole. Sitting at the bottom by the light of the star shells, I find I have a bad wound on the right thigh. I don't think the artery is broken by the way it is bleeding, so I pour my supply of iodine into the wound and bind it up with my field dressing. I find my water bottle has been shot through. Also, my kilt and tunic at the hip is shot to ribbons.
Sensibly, he graduated to trousers.
Yes.
Having survived the ordeal in no man's land over 4 days and 4 nights in a kilt.
Yep.
Perhaps he insisted on trousers.
Yeah.
The first big battle the Australians would fight was meant to be a stunt aimed at diverting German troops away from that madness on the Somme. But the plan went horribly wrong.
The first and the worst battle the Australians fought on the Western Front was at Fromelles. On the 19th of July 1916, they attacked the Germans across flat no man's land, racing into machine gun fire. They didn't stand a chance. They suffered 5,533 casualties in the first 24 hours.
As far as we can make out, this is where the Australian men were, and they were to get across no man's land into the Germans were certainly situated at the back there. So this was completely flat, but it was terribly muddy and a lot of water, a lot of trenches of water all around. I think it looks a terrible long way to me. I don't know how they did it. My father was an ordinary private in the Australian Army. On the night of the 19th of July, they were told that they were to go over the top at 6 o'clock. They'd been given no other information, nothing at all. They couldn't find anyone. They became disoriented as to where they were. So they went back, and night was falling, and so they hid in a shell hole. When they woke up the next morning, they found themselves surrounded on all sides by the German army. And so from that moment on, they were taken prisoner and taken away.
The planning was very confused and contradictory. Some of the British commanders wanted to cancel the whole battle, while others wanted to proceed. Inexperienced recruits went into battle without briefing, without helmets or sufficient ammunition. Others threw grenades without withdrawing safety pins or were killed by their own friendly fire. It was a shocking start for the Australian forces.
Fromelles was a disaster for many reasons, and Fromelles is a very flat country with no real protection for the soldiers. The Germans were able, I think, to sweep the battlefield and to kill the assaulters, and wave by wave. And Fromelles is really important for Australia because it means the first involvement along the Western Front for the Australian Army.
Martial is the local historian and keeps the memory alive with a nearby museum full of artefacts which he shows to the trickle of tourists starting to visit Fromelles.
Good morning. You can see some photographs of Fromelles.
His museum includes the story of a 27-year-old German soldier serving in those opposing trenches, Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler. It was theoretically possible for a keen-eyed Australian to have taken a potshot that could have changed the course of history. One of the Australians who could have succeeded in the task was Military Cross winner Archibald Gunter, very much a part of the Battle of Fromelles.
Uncle Archie, he won a Military Cross. He was a bombardier, and he led the charge into the trenches when they'd been vacated, and bombed the Germans who'd come into the lines and infiltrated into the lines. And it was the efforts of his platoon and himself that saved the day. He was badly shot up, gunshot wounds to the head and the left arm and left leg and buttock, and he was in hospital for some time in England where the King presented him personally with the Military Cross.
By this time, the dead and wounded littered no man's land. But the orders were not to rescue, but to leave them there, despite German requests for a momentary truce to recover them. Unable to ignore the cries of the wounded, Australian Sergeant Simon Fraser crept out in the dead of night to bring back as many wounded as he could. A statue erected at Fromelles honours him today. Most Australians have never heard of Fromelles, especially back then, so many old battle survivors made up stories about their war wounds.
Well, he told people that he was wounded in Gallipoli, and I assume that he told people that because he realised that people could identify with that particular war, that the Battle of Fromelles meant nothing to anyone.
Well, when you say to people, I'm going to Fromelles, they say, where is Fromelles? What happened? They don't know enough about this story. They don't know enough about the men who died here.
Well, my understanding of Fromelles has always been that it was never much said about it. It was censured during the war, after the debacle at Gallipoli. They were realising that they were getting fewer and fewer volunteers, and if the story of Fromelles had got out, they wouldn't have got anybody. Then the Second World War started, and I think that it was forgotten, and not until the late times, I understand, and from what I can see, has Fromelles ever been spoken of.
Tonight on 60 Minutes.
In the tiny French village of Fromelles, nearly 2,000 young diggers died in a single night back in 1916. But at least 170 Australians also vanished that night without a trace. It was one of the great unsolved mysteries of the First World War, until a Melbourne high school teacher named Lambes Anglassos set out to discover what happened to the missing men.
Over the last 6 years, we're doing some research into the missing of Fromelles, those that were killed at or beyond the objective, were gathered and buried by the Germans in pits behind the lines, and we have them by name because the Germans took the ID discs off each of the soldiers and documented them, and we've determined the site, which has now been officially investigated.
Excavation into that deposit revealed the bones of a forearm. What we're doing now, or about to do, is to go back into that trench, continue that excavation for the rest of the 5 pits that we now think are highly likely to contain human remains.
And I'm really hopeful that there'll be a full recovery, that every effort is made to identify them using DNA or whatever means is available, and that each of them is given the dignity of individual reburial, perhaps at a cemetery at the site, a new cemetery at Pheasant Wood.
This is Pozieres on the Western Front. The Allies, including the Australians, came across from the west, heading east, to the German Western Front, which was here at the windmill site. It was a bloody battle that raged for weeks. The Australians suffered 23,000 casualties in several weeks. And Charles Bean says that this is more densely sown with Australian sacrifices than any other place on earth. And Bean should know he was the official correspondent for the entire First World War.
As it happens, my father was wounded at Pozieres. He'd only been in battle one day. He was with the 21st Battalion, and they'd done as they were told, charged across the battlefield, taken a certain amount of ground, then been told to rest in the trenches, and they were told to break out their iron rations. So he got out his bully beef and opened it with his bayonet and was about to munch on this when a shell above Schroeder exploded with shrapnel, and a piece went right through his leg. He was sitting with his legs sitting straight out.
My father wrote a number of letters to his mother. One of these letters describes in some detail in various parts the conditions they had. For example, when he gets to Pozieres, he says, we were out in the open thereafter, digging a topping off trench between our lines and the Huns in front of Pozieres. It was ticklish work because the Huns were within 150 yards and one was constantly ducking when the star shells went up. However, at the end of a week we had dug a pretty good trench and everything was ready for a second attempt. Conditions were atrocious. There was sleet and rain almost all the time. They slept in mud. They got mud in their food, the food that they could eat, and they were generally absolutely appalling.
Unless you've been in a trench with 100 men who are all having to have a bowel movement every day, they have to urinate every day, and you could only do it in the safety of the trench. You couldn't get out of the trench. In the mud there was body parts, arms, legs, and all sorts of brains splattered over the walls and all that sort of thing. And people cannot imagine that.
It's also difficult to imagine that 5 members of one family would ever enlist for this madness. But for the Porter family, this turned out to be the case.
Well, could you tell me, who are these 5 brothers that served in World War I?
Well, we have Robert Daniel Porter, who was my grandfather. He survived, came back. William James, who my father was named after, he was the first one to enlist and he was killed at Gallipoli. Then we've got Sydney, Carl and Bert, or Albert. They joined together, trained together, fought together. Then the first time that they went into the trenches, all 3 of them went in. They were moving up along the line. They were on a fatigue party, obviously doing repairs to the trenches, etc. And the call came back that a porter had been hit, and it turned out to be Sid. So both Carl and Bert, who were further down in the line, rushed forward, And the letter goes that they found Sid lying in the mud with a sergeant foreman treating him, and he had a bullet in the chest, which apparently had penetrated his lungs. Anyway, whilst they were there tending him, turned out my grandfather, who was in the 1st Battalion, was going through the lines delivering a message, and he came across them with Sid in the mud, with a bullet in his chest, his other 2 brothers around him, and supposedly he just gave Sid a kiss, shook the others' hands, and then carried on because he had a message to take to Battalion HQ. I won't say that we made a larger contribution than anyone else, because you had people who maybe only had 1 son and lost that son. Whereas with my great-grandparents, they had 7 sons, lost 3 of them.
I'm the daughter of a soldier who fought in the Somme. He was at Pozières. I don't know much about he didn't talk about his war experiences, but I do remember him mentioning the word Pozières.
Something happened to him there, didn't it?
Yes, he was moving ammunition between trenches, and he caught his foot in a pothole. There have been a lot of those there, I imagine. So, of course, he was useless as a soldier on the front, and he was transferred to the UK. And it was while he was there that he met my mum, who was a Red Cross nurse. He saw her and she saw him, and they obviously fell in love, because from that time on they corresponded, even when he went back to the front. As soon as the war ended, he went straight back to Gloucestershire and proposed to my mother.
Well, from the photographs, it appears that he was quite a dab hand at acting in amateur theatrics. What do you think he was playing a part of?
I don't know what the play was. Dad was dressed up as a woman. I don't think that she'd have fallen for him because of being dressed up in drag. He looked pretty odd in drag, but she still fell for him. Well, he looked funny, didn't he?
There's a girl at the front among the soldiers. She's one of 1,000 girls or more who work.
Joan Begg's mother was one of about 2,500 Australian women to have served as nurses and aides in the war.
Caring with love so sweet and tender for the sons of the mothers who grieve, and many are the hearts that are grateful to now.
Among those who answered the call were the 4 Lowry sisters from Stroud, New South Wales, who came from a poor country family of 11 children, the largest contribution made by one family. Sister Blanche Atkinson enlisted against her father's orders, paid her own fare to the Western Front, but died of tuberculosis contracted during her war service. The well-decorated Sister Margaret Eldridge won her medals for serving 2 years in France, just behind the front line, where her brother, Eric Eldridge, was fighting. As one of the Australian nurses said, when you see them brought in, stretcher after stretcher, in endless procession, you wonder if the next man's face will be one of your friends. It's awful. Everyone is someone's boy.
"1916 was a shocking year for the Australians, and 1917 was worse."
The son of Reg Young, who fought on the Western Front, Alan Young, was a soldier himself in World War II and the Korean War. He has built up a fascination for these battlefields since he was a young lad.
Here was one I was in too.
First war here.
Not too many Australians have been to the Western Front as many times as his 30 trips.
My wife and I decided to make a film to celebrate the 90th anniversary in 2008. When we got into it and realised that this was a major job that we were going to knock over in 6 months, we've been nearly 3 years at it.
He has recorded hundreds of hours of video, collected archival film and photos, and spent countless hours editing his material into projects mainly to help educate the school children of Australia.
We wanted to just give it away, the videos away, to the state schools so the kids could see what we call the untold story.
One of the better-known stories of the Western Front is that the Germans totally surprised the Allies in 1917 by retreating back about 50 kilometres, where they'd set up a last line of heavily fortified defence, which the Allies called the Hindenburg Line. The Allies chased the retreating Germans, capturing enemy prisoners along the way until they reached this Hindenburg Line, which stopped them in their tracks at Bullecourt. The British commanders expected that their Allied infantry would be supported by a fleet of newly arrived tanks. But the tanks got bogged in the mud, broke down, or were disabled by accurate German artillery. The charging soldiers, left on their own, were mown down by withering fire from the German fortress. The Australians fought hard and got as far as the impenetrable fortifications, but suffered 3,000 casualties and hundreds were taken prisoner of war.
The Germans, of course, were great soldiers, great defenders, and in their barbed wire defence they would put gaps in the wire so the troops would be channelled towards the gaps. Naturally, you're going to go towards somewhere where there's less obstacle, and machine guns, of course, would take down the troops in thousands. I think it was insane to expect people to charge across flat, open ground with machine guns the way the Germans had them situated.
We don't know very much about how he was killed, except that it seems to be on the first day of the Battle of Bullecourt. So he somehow was in the front line, and they were just all sent over in wave after wave. The tanks didn't support them as they thought they would, and they were just all killed.
He seemed to be very keen to get into the front line because he says here, I've been taken out of the front line, away from the ranks because I'm underage.
His own family knew that he was underage and tried to stop him enrolling, but the enlisting officers said to them, if you do stop him, he will only enlist under another name and you won't know where he is, so don't do it. And so they couldn't do it, they were quite powerless. He was only 5'6½". He was just a boy. He really didn't know what he was going to. He thought it was an adventure. He thought he was serving his country. He thought France was the most beautiful country he'd seen. And he just had no idea of what it could be like. Towards the end in the letters, he says, there isn't very much to tell you because we're not allowed to write anything. And you can sense that at that stage he's getting frightened because he knows. We got a letter from his commanding officer, which is very unusual because it's written on army field paper. And army people have told me that's very, very unusual to have something like this. Before I write a few words, I would like you all to accept my deepest sympathy in your bereavement. Your brother died as only a brave soldier can. He was laughing and had no fear of dying. It is very hard to think we are losing so many good men over here, and at times when they come out of a battle, I wonder there are any of us left to tell the tale about it.
At Bullecourt, 50% of the Aussies in that battle were casualties and 17% were captured. The German orderlies were just interested more or less in looting them, getting any valuables they could from them. But once they were evacuated to Germany, they were very well treated.
One of the prisoners taken at Bullecourt was Douglas Grant, whose tribal name was Popinjeri, one of 300 Australian Aboriginals who served in the war.
The interesting thing is, when he enlisted in the 34th, they were about to embark, and he was prevented from going and was discharged because he was leaving without permission from the Australian government, which was the regulation at the time. Absolutely astounding. But he just didn't take any notice of it. He went quietly away and re-enlisted in the 13th, and off he went. He would be respected for the very fact that he was a crack shot. When he was in training camp, he had 30 consecutive hits of a moving target at 1,000 yards. I wish I could have done that myself. And that, if you can shoot like that, you gain the respect of anybody in your battalion.
After their disastrous first attempt at Bullecourt, the Allied forces attacked again on May the 3rd. After an artillery barrage, the troops ran forward against a murderous rain of bullets and got through a series of wire barricades. Some crawled under the wire, others climbed over the wire. Dodging bullets, they jumped into the first German trenches, forcing the startled defenders to flee. This was the first time the Hindenburg Line had been broken. Although the British penetrated trenches on the western side, they failed to capture the village itself, leaving the Australians to hang on alone, beating off counterattacks from the Germans.
This is a photo of my dad. He was an engineer on the Western Front.
This is his little diary.
Yeah, that's his diary.
This is the Western Front.
Yeah, that's the Western Front.
This is a Western Front diary.
Yeah, basically,
so
yes.
90 years ago,
yeah,
he was writing in this.
That's right, yes. Tuesday, the 8th of August 1916, breakfast at 8 a.m, went out and pegged our job as far as cemetery. Ground simply torn to pieces with shells, bodies and limbs everywhere, stench something awful.
How did that get written?
Well, I guess he wrote it when he came back, or the next day. If it was night time, I don't know whether they had candles or perhaps hurricane lamps or something like that. I don't imagine they would have had electricity. So, no luxuries.
But it's a pen.
Oh, pen. Oh, yes, pen and ink, yes. Yes, pen and ink.
Amazing.
Yes.
In a trench.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you have to have a bottle of ink.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right.
Dip the pen in.
Yeah,
you
scribble,
can see
scribble.
He's running out of ink here.
Yeah, that's right, and dip it in again.
And it gets very faint there. He
right.
dips it back in.
You forget about that.
Much more solid black there, and then he's run out of ink there.
I think he's tired there too. Probably had enough.
Joy, what do you think he would think if he could see us reading this 90 years later?
I think he'd be very proud. I think I'm proud and interested in what he did. Because I was very, very fond of my dad. He was very special.
I feel a bit emotional now.
Yes, I am. I am emotional. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I'll be right. No, it's sad, but it's wonderful that we've got this, really. And I hope our grandchildren appreciate it too. But goodness knows what will happen. I don't know whether the kids these days are interested in all this sort of stuff or whether they just chuck it in a cupboard.
One group of kids who are interested is the Golden Kangaroos, who frequently visit the Western Front, paying their own way under the leadership of bandmaster Victor Grieve.
Personally, I think it's just nice to be able to take people to the Somme that have never been before, who know very little about the Western Front. The idea of going to the Somme in the first instance is it's an overseas trip. Let's get over there and see France and all the girls and all the rest of it. As we approach the departure date, we give them more information about the real purpose we are going is to take them to the battlefields of the Somme, to enlighten them of the enormous sacrifice of their forebears. They were all affected by seeing graves of young people not much older than themselves, who died so young. The ages of our players were pretty much the same as those young people in the graves. Yeah, on our visits to the Australian memorials on the Somme and in Belgium, we have what we call a gum leaf burning ceremony. In the First World War, sweethearts and wives would send their soldiers 2 or 3 gum leaves in each letter. The diggers would get them all together, stand around and burn them. And of course the smell of the burning gum leaves would bring memories of home. So we like to do that as well. I don't know, it's just that you never know, they might be able to smell it. The diggers, they're around, their spirits are around. In a way, you get that feeling when you're there. I've shed tears, I don't mind. I'm an emotional person. I'm an ex-soldier, so yeah, I don't mind saying I've shed a tear, as we all should, I think. That sacrifice, total waste in a way.
Since the start of the war, one of the most contested sites on the front was this city of Ypres, in the flat region of Belgium known as Flanders. If the Germans took Ypres, they would be well on their way to the English Channel. By mid-1917, the Germans were shelling the city every day from a high ridge 6 kilometers to the southeast called Messines. The British had defended Ypres before, but now the Australians were called in to help at this third campaign to save Ypres from falling into German hands. It soon became a series of battles known as Third Ypres. If the Allies were going to hold Ypres, they would have to take out Messines Ridge. This standoff between Germans and Allies was now in its 3rd year, but both sides were dug in and going nowhere. The British decided the best way to reach the Germans was to tunnel underneath them.
The actual idea of tunnelling under Messines Ridge was put forward by John Norton Griffith, probably the British father of tunnelling. It was called the Big Idea. The Australian Mining Corps essentially was plucked out of the mining fraternity. We had a majority of them come from the Kalgoorlie area, Broken Hill, Charters Towers, Mount Morgan, Gympie.
The plan was for the tunnellers to mine deep beneath the German defences, along the ridge, and plant a series of 19 highly explosive mines that would blow up the German position from beneath their own feet. Unfortunately, the Germans had developed the same idea. Underground mine warfare had begun.
Many a hand-to-hand battle occurred in absolute, total, claustrophobic, dark environments. The only way to tell friend from foe was that the Germans actually had epaulets on their tunics. The 1st Tunnelling Company played a significant role in the guarding the Hill 60 and the Caterpillar mines, the northern end of Messines Ridge, which overlooked the Belgian town of Ypres, or Wipers as the Aussies called it. One particular tunneller, Captain Oliver Holmes Woodward from the 1st Australian Tunnelling Company, a military cross and 2 bars, he threw the vital switch that detonated the famous Hill 60 and Caterpillar mines of the 19 that were fired.
As soon as the 19 explosions were detonated, the Battle of Messines was on. Allied artillery struck with 2,000 guns, 400 trench mortars, and 500 machine guns. 80,000 infantry charged, breaking through the enemy line easily. The Germans suffered 23,000 casualties and lost 7,500 soldiers as prisoners. But the victory also cost the AIF 14,000 casualties. One of them, Jim Esplin's father.
He was wounded with shrapnel wounds, and he had a great big indent in his leg, just under his knee, in the centre of his, down towards his shin, about 3 inches, 90 mil round. And he had a big piece out of his elbow, a big gap, a lot missing from his elbow. And his right hip and his left hip was both badly injured with, with shrapnel wounds. Never complained. He never talked to anyone else about it much.
He talked to you about it?
Yeah, he talked to me. I was the youngest, see, so, I remember him saying, he said once there was a big shell landed, and he said one of their soldiers was blown right up in the air, and with a shovel, he said, and it was amazing, and as he twisted around, the shovel twisted to the same rotation around with him as he'd come back down to the ground, he said, He said just things that he'd never forget, They used to go out and get their dead. Now, when they have a break to get their dead, at a certain time, they go from both sides, the Germans and the Australians, they go and bring their dead back from each side, And he said they'd exchange gifts between each other. When they went, what do you got for me, they'd say, And Dad said that one was a big fat German, they used to call him Fritz, he said, And he said, what do you got for me? He said, here, Fritz, and he pulled out his bayonet, know what I mean? He said, I've got this for you, and as a joke, And he said, the big fat German said, no, 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 put his hands up, and he said, no, only joking, and he put it back, and, they all had a laugh, and, and they exchanged gifts. I remember him telling me that story,
Following the Allied victory at Messines Ridge, Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig was determined to push the enemy line as far back from Ypres as possible, capturing along the way the German-held villages of Broodseinde, Pearl-Capelle and Passchendaele. But first they had to fight through the Polygon Wood. At first light on the 26th, the Allied gunners hit the Germans with artillery and the Allied soldiers charged 1,500 metres into the woods. They suffered 5,000 casualties, but won 2 of the total 52 Victoria Crosses won by Australians at the Western Front. One of them awarded posthumously to Patrick Bugden.
He came to France, he enlisted at 19, came to France at 20, spent his 20th birthday burying bodies. He also led a charge on a pillbox. There were a couple of pillboxes holding up the Australian advance here, and with others they knocked out a pillbox and then disposed of the remaining Germans with bayonets. And on another occasion he saw that an Australian soldier, corporal I think, had been captured and was being led away behind the lines, and so Paddy took off after him, after the German party, and bayoneted all of them and retrieved the corporal. And this was a young man described as being of a sunny and cheerful disposition. A big heart, 21 when he died. I could mention that there were 6 cousins, members of the extended Bugden clan, and only one came home.
My father was Lieutenant James Gospododimead of the 54th Battalion. It's very moving to come here. This was one of the battles that he was in, at the Battle of Polygon Wood. It's emotional to go to all of these cemeteries and all of these sites and see the utter waste. To me, and I have always felt this, that we not only lost the potential of these beautiful young men who were so real heroes, not paper heroes, not football heroes, real men. And they came in their innocence. It was probably best forgotten when you came home. I'm sure they didn't forget. We shouldn't forget.
The eternal flame continues to burn brightly in Australia because of the RSL, the Returned Services League of Australia. So, had it not been for the RSL getting going in World War I, Australians would not remember them. And that's why we can thank the RSL for keeping alive the great ode, Lest We Forget.
After Polygon Wood, the Allied soldiers kept heading east and captured Broodsind. But the muddy winter made it too difficult to secure Poelkapelle, and the Germans held on. Undeterred by the worsening weather, the British commanders ordered the Allied forces on towards Passchendaele.
There was that great Australian saying, "I died in hell, they called it Passchendaele."
Passchendaele, a small village 10 kilometres east of Ypres, Passchendaele has become synonymous with the horrors of the First World War.
All the way up through the Ypres, up to Passchendaele, the mud was just thick up to their waist, and they had to drag one leg after another and often lift one leg out of the mud so they could move forward. There's no describing the nature of the difficulties that these brave young men went through for a long time.
You can only imagine that it was a quagmire, you know, these soldiers trying to go about in those conditions. Must have been horrific for them. Wounded soldiers were virtually drowning in the mud.
It was horrific. Why they allowed the battle to go ahead or the assault to go ahead under those conditions, you'd have to wonder. There were huge casualties from both battalions, but he was advancing up the ridge as one of the 36th Battalion in the assault when he was blown up by artillery shell and hit by shrapnel, and then he got a good dose of mustard gas straight after that, which caused his face and neck to blister, and he was vomiting for several days after that. So yeah, it was pretty savage. They just seemed to be like a shooting gallery for the Germans, you know, fully exposed, advancing up this ridge, and huge casualties, and I think those that survived were very lucky.
The British liked to march in formation across no man's land, like they were on the drill square in London, and became wonderful material for German machine guns. And as Winston Churchill said at the time, why do we have to use the chests of brave young men to stop German machine gun bullets?
Well, this is just a massive pillbox, machine gun post, with a full view of the fields there at Passchendaele. And our Australian troops had to take this pillbox. It's a very, I think, poignant cemetery, because here you've got two machine gun pillboxes that actually did the damage to our troops. And here they are. That's the effect, see, behind it. Captain Clarence Smith Jeffries, VC, aged 23. On Fame's eternal camping ground, their silent tents are spread. It's very moving.
My dad kept diaries for 2 years. If you look at those diaries, you can get a real feel for what really happened there, and you know, what a horrific experience it was. These entries in this diary are associated with the Battle of Passchendaele, which was in October 1917. The teams were out to the forward dumps, shells all round, but no casualties. Then the next entry is 2 motor lorries and 11 men killed on the Menin Road, Hellfire Corner. The next day he says that he saw the worst barrage on the road yet. 11 men killed, 2 motors, 1 GS wagon knocked between the dump and Hellfire Corner. So Hellfire Corner must have been a pretty awful place to be.
Of all of these battles that your father and your uncles are in, it sounds like Passchendaele was one of the...
It'd have to be one of the worst, yes. You can imagine trying to drive mule teams through that kind of mud, loaded with ammunition, or going up to the dumps to get the ammunition, then to take it to the batteries. You can imagine how difficult that would have been. But no, I think they should always be well and truly remembered. You know, people say they gave their lives, but you can also say they had their lives taken away from them.
The series of battles known as Third Ypres was a grand plan, but a very costly one, claiming the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers. Many of them perished without any trace, their only memorial a name on the side of Menin Gate, the town gate through which the soldiers had passed en route to those battles to save this Belgian city. Increasingly attended by Australians, local authorities have played the last post here every day since 1928. This great sacrifice finally hit home for the Australian government, with the Minister of Veterans Affairs, Alan Griffin, attending the Meningate ceremony in 2008, where he laid a wreath confirming the growing importance of the Western Front.
My grandfather was a soldier in the 5th Division. To walk at a place where he would have walked and to get a sense of what he might have gone through all those years ago, seeing the pictures and the images of the horror of what those men went through, it really does affect you. And it makes you think about how lucky we are, but how much we should remember what they did.
1917 became Australia's worst year of warfare ever. 20,000 Australians had been killed, more than the total number of Australian soldiers killed on all the battlefields of the Second World War. (1918) began very well for Germany because Russia, the enemy they had been fighting on the Eastern Front since 1914, withdrew from the war. The Communists had just taken over Russia and now wanted peace. Now Germany was free to move their troops, arms and ammunition from the Eastern Front across to the Western Front. The news was out that America would be joining the Allied forces in the middle of the year. Germany needed to strike quickly to force an end to the war before the Americans arrived. On the 21st of March, Germany launched its infamous Spring Offensive right along the Western Front, attacking British forces with more strength than ever before. As Germans recaptured towns and villages lost to the Allies in 1917, Field Marshal Haig said, "Now we really have our backs to the wall." If the Allies were going to stop this German steamroller, Haig would need all the help he could get, especially from the Australian Imperial Force. If the German Spring Offensive was to succeed, they would need to control the railway centre of Amiens. To do this, they would have to capture the strategic village of Villers-Bretonneux. On the 24th of April, the Germans attacked the village with 4 divisions of crack infantry troops and, for the first time, with heavily armoured tanks. After some very fierce fighting, they captured it. Outraged by this audacious German victory, the Allied officers wanted to retaliate the very next day, the 25th of April, a date that meant something special for the Anzacs. It was the 3rd anniversary of the already famous Gallipoli landing, and the Australians made sure they won.
My contention is that in 1918, the 5 Australian divisions on the Western Front in 1918 were probably the single finest combat force Australia has ever sent from its shores. Compared to the Anzacs in 1914, they were consummate soldiers. They'd been honed to absolute efficiency. Very little military requirement was beyond them. You know, they could mount an attack, they could change direction in the middle of the attack, they could do a fighting retreat and then turn about and come back and attack again. They were just superb soldiers.
When the sun rose on the 3rd anniversary of Anzac Day, Australia's General Monash wrote, "I looked down upon the Australians in full possession of the whole town, with nearly 1,000 German prisoners to their credit. They won, and winning, they proved themselves the equal of the finest troops who ever fought in our history."
Well, according to Dad's diary, it was an incredible victory, and I don't know whether they had a few beers afterwards, but boy, they deserved it. I wish I'd known it now, what I knew. I'd have more respect for my old man, I can assure you.
Are you proud of him looking back now?
Incredibly so. Incredibly so. Stop it, I can't go on. No, I wore this today for the first time. This is his dog tag, and it meant more to me than his 2 medals. This was here, this was being worn on this day, 90 years ago. For God's sake, I mean, it's just incredible.
But while some Australians won medals at Villers-Bretonneux, others, like Jeff Gunter's uncle, were killed.
George Algernon, known to us as Uncle Algie. He was running, as I understand, across no man's land, the area between the opposing trenches, running to complete a telephone line. It was supposed to be done as a voluntary act, and just didn't make it. He was just blown to pieces, smithereens. And now I realise that it could have been me, it could have been my father, and to see the trauma and the sadness that it's created, it makes it pretty poignant, the whole thing.
It may be 90 years since the end of World War I, and many people may have forgotten it, but not here in the Somme, especially in the little village of Villers-Bretonneux, which were liberated by the Australians 90 years ago. And so the locals commemorate that victory by filling the town with signs of Australia.
The Australian liberators were well loved, especially by the women and children. Marguerite Deval, now in her late 90s, remembers the Australians well.
Oh yes, there were some handsome soldiers. If I was 20 years old. We slept in Amiens, and the next morning we took the train, and they gave us some nourishment, some bread and some ham. And my mother said, "Oh, we've eaten meat." I remember. We thank the Australians very much for making the schools and for everything they've done in Villers. They have been very generous, the Australians. We keep really beautiful memories of them. But you know, there are lots of French people who are going to visit the memorial. Lots of French people.
Following the example of the local French people, the Australian government finally held its first dawn service here at Villers-Bretonneux to commemorate the 90th anniversary of the Anzac Day liberation of the village.
By dawn on Anzac Day, at this time, on this day, 90 years ago, the Germans were retreating. But this story is not as well known in Australia as it should be. It must be said that our strong connection with the Anzacs at Gallipoli has, over the years, overshadowed our commemoration of the Australians who gave so much on the Western Front.
The first ever dawn service here on the Western Front at Villers-Bretonneux was so emotional and so well supported by thousands of Australians that it may be the shape of things to come.
This should go on for eternity, I think. And I'm very glad to see that the way this place is kept and looked after, it's extraordinary. I think it should. It's money well spent by our government, our people. Very well done.
My father served on the Somme. He survived. I have a cousin's grave to visit also. It's a very special day.
My great-grandfather was in the 3rd Battalion, and then he got sent into the 13th Battalion and was fighting over here. We went and found his grave the other day, so we got to put a little cross there, and yeah, it was the most beautiful experience to come here and celebrate what they've done for us.
People have remembered this. The local people have remembered it, and Australians have come through this area, and many looked up their relatives, their grandparents, granduncles who've fallen here in the past. But there's been a resurgence of interest, it seems to me, this year in particular.
My great-grandfather fought here, but he wasn't part of the Australian, he was part of the French. He was part of the French army. So I'd like to find his name. Pardon?
How does it make you feel?
Good, different, because I'm in France, and so I can also imagine what my grandpa felt. But then again, I'm an Aussie, so I can feel what the Aussies felt.
Why we came? Because my dad actually fought in the battle. In the battle on the 24th and 25th.
My great-grandfather, who fought in at the Somme from 1916 1919, and he got back eventually, but I'm just here just to get the feeling of the place and sort of wouldn't miss it for the world.
This is the village of Hamel. It's where Monash and the Australian forces on the 4th of July 1918 had the most stunning victory of all on the Western Front. In 93 minutes, they captured the town from the Germans. They did so by introducing a new kind of warfare where they used all the resources and the technology of the day. For the first time, they used aircraft, heavy artillery, Mark V tanks, every conceivable weaponry that Monash could muster.
Monash said that the infantry's job was to follow the artillery and the tanks and let them do the hard work, and the infantry's job was to occupy the ground once the artillery and the tanks had done the hard and dirty work. He brought everything, up to 300 people into a conference before the Battle of Hamel, and they discussed it and discussed it and discussed it until everybody was happy with what they were going to do, as opposed to the earlier British system of do this.
Just before the battle, Prime Minister Billy Hughes arrived to inspect his Australian Imperial forces for the first time. General Monash showed him around, although privately he said, Hughes had chosen a time which could hardly be more inconvenient. But the Prime Minister was impressed by this Melbourne civil engineer who brought his experience in employing the latest techniques and technologies from his Melbourne drawing boards to his Western Front battle plans.
Over there.
For Hamel, he was given an extra mission.
That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere.
The Americans had now entered the war, and they asked Monash to introduce 800 of their Yankee rookies to these new fighting conditions. For an extra bit of inspiration, Monash planned the attack on their Independence Day, the 4th of July. He forced the Germans underground with heavy artillery, while aircraft flew over the lines to hide the sound of his tanks moving into position. Then the Australian and American infantrymen attacked, supported by the tanks, catching the Germans completely by surprise. The Aussies and the Yanks together captured another 1,500 prisoners, along with their 200 machine guns, trench mortars and anti-tank weapons. Monash's revolutionary planning had paid off.
He said the Battle of Hamel would be over in 90 minutes. He miscalculated it by 3 minutes. It took 93 minutes.
The Australian Prime Minister said of Monash, "He was the only general who seemed to give weight to the cost of victory in human lives. This stamped Monash in my mind as an outstanding Australian commander in World War I."
We're in the village of Hamel, liberated by the Australians on the 4th of July 1918, and these school children here learn all about the story because their professor, their teacher, teaches them every year in their history class, and they fly the Australian flags every day all year in gratitude for the Australians liberating the village of Hemel, one of Monash's greatest victories.
My father, John McCubbing, was injured here on the 4th of July, 1918. Shrapnel wound to the head and gunshot wound to the shoulder. It ended his war, and indeed he was classed as 66% disabled evermore.
There were major implications for the veterans returning from World War I. Physical disability was obviously visible and received more sympathy and interest from the community. What wasn't understood at all in that era was the phenomenon of shell shock. Both my grandfathers fought on the Somme, and one of them had shell shock, and until he died in his 70s, still having nightmares. So the mental health casualties were not understood, and it's not until really the Vietnam veterans return that psychiatrists, psychologists and mental health practitioners have really understood and developed the diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder.
People said, so I'm told, that he was never the same person when he came back home that he was before. Probably lost some of the sense of fun that he had before he went away. I know now, because I can diagnose it, that he had post-traumatic stress syndrome, but who'd heard of that in those days? But he had nervous problems, and as children I can remember him having really severe nightmares, appalling nightmares. Just used to hear these awful yelling and yelps and so on. No, I don't remember any words or anything. Maybe they were, but this was through the wars. But I just remember these awful noises. I can still hear them.
With the tide turning against Germany, the time had come for the Allies to launch the biggest offensive of the year, from the city of Amiens. The objective, to force the German troops all the way back to Germany. On the 8th of August 1918, they attacked, with 4 British divisions, 4 Canadian divisions, the 1st French Army, and Monash's 5 Australian divisions. 1 million men advanced, behind a barrage of artillery from 1,000 Allied guns, the biggest Allied advance of the war. The Battle of Amiens was a resounding success. The Allies punched a 12-mile-long gap in the German front line and now had another 16,000 prisoners of war, all of whom had to be housed and fed. Their glorious and decisive victory, General Monash later recorded, will re-echo throughout the world and live forever in the history of our homeland. It was the beginning of the end of the war. The German commanding officer, Erich Ludendorff, wrote, "August 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of the war. This was the worst experience I had to go through." One of the men who witnessed that German devastation firsthand was Tony Bevan's grandfather, Basil Helmore.
Yes, and I've got a letter when he wrote back to his father. Reveille went at 4 a.m. on the eventful day. The morning was misty, and in the dim light we packed our blankets and gear on the wagons and had breakfast in preparation for the follow-up. In the distance, muffled by the misty atmosphere, we could hear the rumble of the barrage, which we knew was smashing the enemy's line and opening the way for the great advance. We were soon on the road from Amiens to Villiers.
So he's now in German territory. They've just occupied it, and what happened next?
After a short journey, we came to the trenches, a little further ahead, the German lines. An hour or two before, it had been a scene of hell let loose. Even the guns were silent. The buildings were very much knocked about and showed that our heavy guns had not been idle for the past few months. During our stay, there were several batches of German prisoners came in, and I did my best to fulfil their pitiful request for water. All seemed very glad to be out of it. One could not entertain feelings of bitterness against those poor humans, themselves fighting for their country and with their dear ones anxious at home. None of them, I suppose, like war any more than we do.
This fabulous monument of a digger is a tribute to the men of the 2nd Division who captured Mont St Quentin here late August 1918 before going into Peronne, which they also captured in early September. Monash said they could do it. Rawlinson from the British Army said they couldn't and they shouldn't, but Monash went ahead and he proved that the British were wrong because the men of the 2nd Division captured not only Mont St Quentin here in a very difficult battle, but also Peronne.
Monash was sticking his neck out because his forces were definitely under strength. But the Australians still fought their way up Mont St Quentin against the Germans who were defending the heights. When they secured the top, so many Australians were wounded they couldn't hold it, let alone go on to capture the village.
My father, as they advanced up the ridge, was hit by 3 machine gun bullets and was severely wounded. He was initially bandaged by a Sergeant Abbott, who was subsequently killed. He dragged himself out of the line of fire, and the stretcher bearers were out there trying to get the wounded off the field, and they were driven back by machine gun fire, and they made one last sortie out to pick up wounded, and they'd picked up the last guy, and he died on the stretcher. So they put my father on it and brought him back, and otherwise he wouldn't have survived that.
Nobody knows how hard those guys worked. The stretcher bearers they were pretty much the great heroes who had to go out unarmed and pick up the dead and wounded in the dark.
At first light, the Germans regrouped and counterattacked and took back the summit of Mont St Quentin. The Australians retreated down the hill and held their positions just out of sight overnight. On the 1st of September, with reinforcements, they recaptured this desperately contested summit.
Your grandfather had a diary, right? This is it.
Yep, right here, Jonathan. It's an amazing account. August 27th, left Boosie, August 27th by motor and went into billets on hill the same night. Bivouacked the next night, hopped over on the left sector at daylight under heavy barrage. Bivouacked for a day and a half at Cliff on the Somme bank and attacked Sunday, September the 1st under heavy barrage. It's incredible, you know.
It's blow by blow.
Yeah, reached objective east of Peronne and were relieved on Wednesday night. And these guys knew what they were doing and they were making progress. So it's amazing to have just a handwritten account.
How did Leslie Lucas get involved in the war?
Well, he grew up in Queensland on the land and was pretty keen to sign up from the reports that I've got from family, but he was the one of 7 kids. He had 6 sisters and 6 sisters. So he obviously thought, well, this is my duty to do the right thing, I suppose, like all men did. But according to reports from my family, he was waiting to sign up. He was anxiously waiting for his 18th birthday to sign up, and when he did, he was quoted in the Maryborough newspaper article dated October 17th, 1917, that he was the best proportioned candidate in point of physique accepted at the Maryborough depot. So they're obviously impressed that this big strapping bloke off the land, the young bloke who turned 18, was ready to sign up. So we then travelled to Sydney, and I guess he was at Victoria Barracks, which we can see in the photograph, and sailed out on the Ormond in early 1918. But he just looks, in all the photographs, he just looks like a young, just a regular bloke, you know, like all the men. They just have this sense of innocence about them where they're not quite sure what they're getting into, but they sure as hell found out when they got there.
They moved into the town, shooting their way into the centre against die-hard snipers and German strongpoints that refused to give up. Finally, after some deadly house-to-house fighting, they captured Perron. It cost 3,000 Australian casualties. One of those Perron casualties was Lyle Howard of the 3rd Pioneer Battalion, the father of former Prime Minister John Howard.
The family legend and the records and the diary appears to confirm this. He was in battle for only a short period of time. I think 20 minutes was the period my mother used to say, and he was wounded in the stomach, and that was it. But he could have been killed. That was the lottery of war.
Did your dad write letters back?
Yeah, he wrote letters back to his mother, and he used to write. They were always fairly brief. He was fairly laconic. He didn't say a lot. He was a man of few words. He was certainly involved in the Battle of Mont St Quentin, and it was on the eve of that battle that he met his own father, briefly at a little village called Clery, and it's recorded, simply recorded in his diary, saying, met Dad at Clery, nothing more. It's quite unusual to have a father and son in the same war. That is unusual. What made it, I suppose, unusual was that my grandfather volunteered at at the age of 44. Extraordinary. I mean, I can just imagine what, you know, what would be in your mind was that this would be the last time we'll see each other, because we both could be blown up in the next 24 hours or whatever, because they knew there was a big stunt coming, as they used to call it, and I imagine that would be. But then you got to accept that they'd be living with that possibility every day of their lives.
My great uncle George Spencer, G.G. Spencer, he was a gunner, and he didn't make it home. So yeah, it was very sad for our family. So we travelled to the cemetery, and we sent the girls off in one direction, and Fiona and I went another direction, and we eventually found Gigi's grave. And yeah, there wasn't we all just, you know, we had a tear in the eye, and it was emotional, you know. It's when you know that that's your blood lying in the soil there in France. His plot was actually there was nothing there, it was well maintained, but we wanted to plant something, so we decided to drive down to Mullincore, the little village, and obviously there weren't any nurseries, but we found this one little farmhouse covered in all these beautiful potted plants, and I knocked on the door, and this old lady came out, and I had all photographs and documents to the Australian War Graves Commission and explained the story, and straight away, without a word, she just embraced me and she hugged me, and she kept saying thank you, thank you. And obviously she still felt, you know, how the Australian soldiers did so much for not only her village, but for all of the villages on the Somme. But to be embraced by an elderly French woman 87 years later just gives me goosebumps. It's incredible. She gave me the most beautiful plant that she had in her yard and said, you take this and I will look after the grave for you once you have left.
we're now into early October in 1918, and Billy Hughes had been in London since June, and he was informed at the Imperial War Cabinet meetings that the war could go on until 1919, 1920. And Billy Hughes could see that we're now coming up into the winter. He needed to have his troops rested. So he demanded that the troops be withdrawn, and he put a deadline on of the 15th of October.
But Monash was on a roll now, and on the 5th of October he sent in his tanks, aeroplanes and troops from his 5 divisions for this one last battle for the hilltop village of Montbriand. It was the last Australian battle of the war. The town was infested with German machine gunners dug in, determined to make this their last-ditch stand.
The attack was to start at 6:05 in the morning. There were each battalion of the 3 attacking battalions that went in were given 4 tanks to go in with them. Montbriand was taken. The battle itself was one of the finest pieces of that the AIF did on the Western Front. In 1918, they were 10% of the Allied forces, and they captured 25% of, all the guns and divisions that were wiped out and prisoners. So they certainly played above their weight.
Once again, the Australians proved their worth in this last battle at Montbriand, but sadly suffered 430 casualties, including some of those who had fought at the very first battle at Gallipoli.
Amongst those men killed were some of the finest leaders in those brigades. So they lost some great senior officers and NCOs, which, thank heavens, they didn't have to replace because they no longer went into battle.
You cannot come to this little tiny cemetery of Montbriand without getting a nice BM view or welcome from Rosalind Bury and some of the other residents of this little village. And it's very touching that the French people remember it so well, the liberation of their village of Montbriand by the Australians.
Ah, je reconnais, madame. Vous êtes déjà venue? Ici. Ici? Ici.
The Germans had had enough. With their army routed and woefully short of men and no available recruits, Germany had no option but to call it quits. They had lost 1 million men in the final 9 months of the war.
So eventually, after 4 years of war and many battles by the Australians here on the Western Front, the armistice was signed at 11 o'clock on the 11th of the 11th, 1918, here at Compagna in the forest on a railway carriage. La guerre est finie. The great day for which we have been longing, striving and waiting for 4 weary years has come at last and has brought us the complete and triumphant victory that our high and noble cause merited. Home and Australia emerge from the shadow land of hope and assume a substantial form at last. After all, why should I have been spared?
Wow. When the armistice occurred, he was in hospital in England. Oh, there's no doubt he was very pleased because it was meant that at long last he wasn't going to be patched up and thrown into the fray again. At long last he was going to head home.
The soldiers never received the recognition they deserved. But, as Jonathan King and the descendants have shown us, finally the Western Front is emerging from behind the shadow of Gallipoli, and there can be no going back. It has become part of Australian history. Let this be a timely tribute to the 46,000 Australians who died and to the 250,000 who played such a big part in winning World War I.
Australia as a nation, if you like, came of age during World War I. If you like, Gallipoli was the first stage of that. But the Western Front was, frankly, the growing into adulthood. And the circumstances around that, something that's well worth remembering.
The Australian dead are probably better remembered in Belgium and in France than they are in Australia.
We've reached that moment in our history when everything is passing from memory into history. And when you get to that point in relation to great events, there's always a determination to hang on to them.
I want to honour their memory and I want to be able to show my children and future generations what the sacrifices that these men made.
In Flanders Fields, where poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly scarce heard among the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields.